just want to thank you for joining the Get Clear on Compliance, Environmental Compliance Consideration in an Evolving Regulatory Framework webcast. So, one of the reasons we stand as the world's premier investment location, the world's third largest economy, you all have always heard my talking points. We do $200 billion in CapEx annually, creating 200,000 plus new American jobs. But one of the reasons that we are able to perform like that, which is well above any other region on the planet, is because it just is what it is. We have the best economic developers and the best economic development community connecting and strategizing around the most timely issues of the day, which is what we are going to do today. So throughout the next hour or so, or throughout the next few minutes, we'll discuss regulatory changes anticipated from our friends in the new federal administration, which is a really important conversation. So we thank you all for staying on top of this and being with us. So before I introduce our speaker, just want to say, as we move through the slides here, be thinking of questions. You can pop those in the chat. Chris may or may not get to those in the forthcoming slides. If not, just at the end of this, we'll have a Q&A session. So we'll all just have a family fireside chat here together at the end of this. So with that said, be thinking of good questions. I'm really, really happy to introduce Chris Hurst, the Senior Environmental Engineering Consultant with one of our key member investor partners at Terracon. So thank you to the Terracon team, to Chris, and the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining in on the webinar and this knowledge share for you today. As we said, we're kind of talk about some of the regulatory compliance framework and some considerations that really should keep in mind. And this is really tailored for a lot of industrial manufacturing clients, but could be for anybody really. So, and we'll talk about the agenda here in a second. So I'm just going to kind of push through the slides. A little bit of background, certainly I have a fair amount of experience, coming up about 30 years within the profession. I started my career in manufacturing industrial up in Kentucky at a packaging company. So as an intern, while I was getting my chemical engineering degree, I fell into the environmental world, doing an environmental internship. And so at that company in Shelbyville, Kentucky, manufactured Wrigley's chewing gum wrappers, Capri Sun drink pouches. So it was a foil and film packaging production company, a lot of different environmental aspects and touch points. But my career brought me to Georgia back in 1996, worked for the state agency for Georgia EPD for about 11 years within a variety of different sectors in the clean air or the air protection branch, the water protection branch, and the hazardous waste branch. And then in and out of consulting, working in private sector where I managed 3 special chemical plants that we did co-packaging for aerosols, a lot of different things from air fragrances to lubricants to paints and so forth. So a lot of different opportunities to see and be engaged with manufacturing industrial clients. And so well versed in that area. But we're going to kind of talk about some different aspects. But, one thing I want to talk about really out of the gate here is I would love to say this is going to be a deep dive into all the various changes that are happening at a federal EPA regulatory basis. But it's not really meant to be that. As you know, it's very dynamic. There's a lot of changes that have been coming up out of the new administration. And, a lot of things are either being pulled back or some thoughts about how to improve things. So, I'll touch on that, but really it's about getting to the fundamentals and not losing track of some of those obligations that we have with regard to environmental touch points and aspects for your operation or for your client. So, one thing to stress is that we always want to make sure that you understand that when there's regulatory changes, that doesn't mean that a lot of times, or most of the time, that these fundamentals need to be glossed over. So at the end of the day, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, RCRA, NEPA, there's going to be these requirements that are in place that you should always keep in mind and don't lose sight of. So even with all these different changes that are happening with regard to the federal and at some point possibly state level, just making sure that everyone understands that there's going to be things that need to be met and kept up with at any given time. So as mentioned, certainly feel free to drop things into the chat. As I see them, I'll be able to respond to them, but we'll try to hold questions and the answers to the end. Presentation is about 30 slides, so I expect it will certainly be within an hour of the time period. And so we should have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'm happy to entertain any questions you may have regarding an area that I can opine on. So Objectives, obviously, I mentioned that we really want to talk about those baseline environmental requirements, but we're also going to cover things such as compliance, resources, and planning and considerations regarding projects and growth, and when you're looking at trying to do an expansion at a facility. So all these different things touch on different aspects of regulatory compliance and that life cycle of starting with, groundbreaking or even pre-planning before you get to groundbreaking, all the way to the evolution of the operation coming online. And so it's important to keep all these things in mind. So that will go on to the next slide. Now, obviously the one thing that I see a lot of is what I call this Groundhog Day effect, where it seems like anytime you're working on a new project, a new pursuit, there's always this sort of reinventing the wheel or going back to the same questions and potentially trip ups with regard to a project. So whether it's a new facility or expansion and existing facility, adding new production lines, there's always seems to be these common thread of things that are potentially missed or overlooked. And so, we're always really trying to stress that, do that due diligence, do that pre-planning, make sure you have all your ducks in a row before you start engaging on that process to avoid those potential situations where you could have impacts to the project timeline that potentially could, hopefully not, but, delay the implementation or startup of an operation. Again, these perspectives are really focused on the environmental side of things. I'm certainly not going to try to talk about ideas on financial aspects or funding for projects. It's just really talking about those environmental aspects and touch points. So, really when you're talking about a substantial growth or new growth or expansion, there's always a lot of competing needs and obligations. So, really what we're trying to understand is how do you balance all those priorities and those competing commitments to make sure that things aren't overlooked, that things aren't missed. And there's tools out there as far as trying to use budgeting tools, milestone tools, Gantt charts and such. But it's really about trying to make sure that you have information that's accurate and it's shared with the teams so that you can avoid those potential mishaps and missed opportunities. So when we talk about the project team, it's always important to make sure information is out there, that it's available, that assignments are clearly understood. And those are some basic concepts that certainly apply across the board beyond environmental aspects and environmental permitting and regulatory compliance. But it is really important to be able to have those kind of key concepts in line and locked in before you start moving forward in a project. So I mentioned baseline environmental requirements. There's the federal requirements of the Clean Air Act, RCRA, Clean Water Act, NEPA, others that we don't touch on. But those really set the basis of what those obligations are for any entity. Now, there's going to be state deviations, and some states will have their own regulatory obligations and compliance touch points, but a lot of the states are going to mirror what the federal regulations have been set up. And so really, when you're talking about understanding what those environmental requirements are, it's understanding that in most cases, the federal requirements are always going to have that prevailing dominance within the project that the states either fall in line with or sometimes have state deviations. But when we talk about these new developments and changing environmental regulatory situations with new administrations, every 4 years we have a new cycle of either importance or shifting of priorities from one area to another. And sometimes that means rolling back certain regulations or increasing regulatory standards in another area. But at the end of the day, it's about keeping everything in focus as far as what are those fundamental obligations. And we're going to talk about those points a little bit more focused moving forward. So, and we talk about economic development and regulatory drivers. Really, one of the key things here is to remember that as regulations change, that doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means it's change and change happens. And so at the end of the day, it's really understanding what those regulatory changes are, how it impacts you, your operation, your client's operations, your customers' operations, and what that means in the way of what they need to adapt or adjust to and understand what that can do. Obviously, during periods of growth, if you have a project underway that's in the initial planning stages or in the pre-development stages or even development stages, regulatory changes can have an immediate impact upon what you need to do with that particular project, and whether there's a change in a requirement for a permit or a change in expectation as far as releases to the environment, the project team needs to readjust and say, does this impact us right now? Is it a regulatory change that actually has a sunset or a sunrise or an enactment date that's several years out that won't impact your project? But it's always important to be able to keep your eyes and ears open to these changes and what they mean for your operation. One thing also, as we know, that the economy is an international economy. We're trying to bring some manufacturing back to the U.S., which is great. We're trying to reestablish ourselves as being dominant in a lot of different sectors. But there's always going to be that difference between U.S. and international regulation. As we potentially change regulations on a federal state or a federal basis, certainly we're going to see a little bit departure from what that looks like from our counterparts within Europe and Asia and elsewhere. So it's always important to know that if you have operations that there's going to be differences. Now, on a big picture from a federal and international, certainly we'll talk about this a little bit further in some upcoming slides, but there are key differences on a state level as well. So when we talk about changes happening on a federal level, you have to be mindful that sometimes the states may actually not roll back some requirements. And so just because the federal government changes something doesn't mean that the states are going to modify their regulations. So at the end of the day, really one important thing about this is I've never considered regulations to be a problem or a hindrance. But really what we find is working with clients is sometimes the complexity, the clarity, how the rules and regulations are set up and how effective they are can be problematic. Having worked in the private sector and having to navigate requirements from all over the federal government and state government, there is a lot to keep up with. And so certainly the idea of trying to clarify and improve rules and streamline is something everybody hopefully wants to be able to make happen to get improvement, to make things easier. So next slide. So I mentioned federal versus state versus local, right? There's a very big difference between them. So as you're understanding what the impacts to your project, to your client, to that expansion look like, it's important to keep in mind that there are going to be differences between them. One thing that's often overlooked is local requirements. I've seen more and more of that in the last several years of working with clients all over the U.S., where the term, it's a little bit dated, but NIMBY, not in my backyard, that you have certain interest groups, certain public sector interests that are fearful of something, fearful of technology, fearful of an industry, and therefore there's sometimes local ordinances that are passed that prohibit. I've seen this happen where they prohibit a certain industry or a certain client from developing. And so even when you're thinking that you're in line with federal requirements and or state requirements, it's always important to understand what that local code requirements may be, what they're going to allow or not allow because of the perceived concerns regarding a particular operation. So one thing is certain is, in my opinion, regulatory certainty is very different than no regulation. So regulatory certainty, when we talk about rolling back regulations or adding new regulations, whatever the case may be, it's certainly better for everyone to have an understanding of what is required, what are those touch points, what are those obligations, because if you don't know that, then you're always guessing, okay, what's that going to mean for my operation 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years down the road? So having that clarity really, really helps as far as economic development, as far as companies trying to understand if I want to site an operation in California versus Florida versus New York, knowing what those regulatory requirements are out of the gate, avoiding that subjectivity really makes a big difference on helping them understand what is going to be the better location for their operations. So I'm never really, and I don't think anyone should be taken aback if there's talk about rolling back regulations or changing regulations, as long as we understand what those regulations are and there's clarity. Not having regulations are just as problematic as not knowing what those requirements are, because if you have no regulations, as much as there's a lot of great TV shows about the Wild West and just Wild West justice, no one wants to have a playing field where there's no rules. It becomes chaotic, especially if the federal government has no guidance for states. And states, you could have 52 different perspectives on what needs to happen with control of an emission from an air source or a release from a wastewater source. So, federal regulations are important and need to stick around. And certainly, I think everyone's on board with that idea that you don't want an unregulated playing field, because that just creates chaos and it's going to make it harder for development to actually occur, in my opinion. So, what are we talking about? Obviously, there's a number of federal regulatory requirements and obligations out there, anywhere from the standard ones, big ones of Clean Water Act, of RCRA, Clean Air Act, Waters of the U.S., NEPA. A lot of these buzzwords, a lot of these terms being bounced around quite a bit here recently about rollbacks, changes to them. What are the obligations? And so, certainly within 20, 30 minutes, you can't even begin to talk about all the changes that are happening in each of these areas. But it just really gets down to make sure that you're partnering with individuals that help you understand where those touch points are for your project, for your client, and making sure that everyone understands what they need to do in order to avoid potential pitfalls. So one of the pitfalls, some of the things you really consider when you're talking about planning and regulatory aspects related to a project, one of the first things that come to my mind is project timelines. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Identification of project needs and relate it to understanding what are your obligations and your commitments. And then, all those environmental touch points regarding what do we need to do for permitting, for pre-planning, for prior to storming the site, all those different environmental planning aspects, those different permitting aspects related to when do we need to start the process of looking at getting a construction permit for our facility related to air permits. And so all those type of things are really important to get framed up in advance of going down that pathway to understand what needs to happen. And that's really gets into some of these different things that are really reported on a local aspect. And I mentioned that before, one thing we see often is missed is local code requirements or applicable code requirements, where there is a really good diligence placed on understanding what the federal requirements are and or state requirements. But there are situations where potentially something could be missed at a local basis, whether it's a zoning issue, whether it's, I've seen issues where companies look to add a new line that had a particular stack that required a certain height, and they put the equipment in and found out there was an ordinance on height requirements for stacks. So they had to go back and modify that equipment, change up blowers, change up the stack height after the fact. So the more you know up front as far as what those regulatory drivers are across the board, the more you avoid potential missteps or gotchas later on in the process. And as I mentioned here, no one knows, exactly what's going to happen. You don't have a crystal ball to say you know what the future holds, right? Everything is very dynamic. Project teams will have to be able to identify potential new aspects or changing aspects and understand what those future drivers look like regarding being able to manage that project to avoid pitfalls, but also be dynamic to be able to adjust to those when they come in. So staying abreast of current federal, local requirements. I know there's a lot there. It's a big universe of regulatory requirements from A to Z, and not everyone can manage all those tasks. And so we talk about delegating that work and looking to other resources to be able to help manage what those impacts are and aspects are related to your project to be able to keep those in focus. So we'll talk a little bit about that, some slides later on about what resources are out there to help manage that information, and we're able to find that requirements to be able to keep those in frame and focus for your operation and for your project. So, I mentioned, planning charts, Gantt charts, and one thing I often see is that there seems to be a simplification of what those requirements are. And this is just a little snippet of a chart, a Gantt chart, and it doesn't show everything in here. But the takeaway from this particular project when I was working on it, when they put out this particular idea of what they need to do as far as project touch points, is they only had one line related to permitting and environmental permitting. It was basically file a regulatory application, review permits, and receive permits. Well, where I'm going with this is they had permits in multiple sense. Well, as probably most of you know, or will know, that there are a variety of different touch points within different environmental aspects. So an air permit, a water permit, NEPA, wetlands and delineation, endangered species, All these have different timelines. All these have different permitting requirements as far as when you submit a permit or a report and when that will come in. So the idea that you have one timeline for associated for all environmental aspects is a bit dangerous in a way, because you're not really giving full accounting for what those steps are. So it's always important when we talk about environmental aspects and framing out and understanding what that life cycle is of that particular obligation, pre-planning during the project initiation, construction, and finalization. Before you get to that, so many things need to happen as far as obtaining that construction permit or that review from an agency to allow you to move forward. So even starting with Gantt charts with project teams, it's good to try to build out as much clarity as possible to identify all those different aspects and get them locked in to the best of your ability as far as when you think that timing is going to take place. An example of that, obviously, was this kind of life cycle here of, confirming the location out to construction process. This is just 3 touch points: review permits, receive permits. And as we know, that timeline is going to be very different from an air permit for a wetland delineation versus, a water discharge permit and so forth. So there's a lot of different timelines that happen during that life cycle. And so that's usually one thing I see, is that we often have a lot of clients that don't have that awareness of there's an obligation, say, for an air permit in their operation until late. And then they are in a situation where they're reaching out to a company such as us, say, hey, we need to get a permit within 60 days. And the reality is that in most cases, an air permit, if it's a significant air permit, say a Title V major source, it could take 6 months to get through that process. So automatically, you might have a 4-month delay in your startup of your operation because of missing that air permit requirement early on in the process. And that holds true for a lot of other environmental aspects. So this whole, planning and timeline is very, very important. Another consideration that comes in is project delays and project accelerations. And it goes both ways. Sometimes a project speeds up. For a variety of reasons, scheduling may become a situation where they need to get the work done sooner, so they can be able to take advantage of resources that are available, or cash flows. They certainly have maybe a window where they need to be able to tap into financial resources that are available for a shorter window duration, and they need to capitalize or spend that money quickly. And project delays, certainly weather could be delayed in fundings, whatever the situation may be. That's part of a strategy of when you're trying to go into a new project, to think what those delays or those speed up periods would look like, and plan for those as best you can. And planning for them is just saying, what do we do in that situation? What are the tools that we could bring to the table to be able to help navigate those kind of situations so that we can be able to keep things moving? So they're equally important, and they both could have impacts to overall project success. We talk about the changes are happening at a federal level with the environmental potential rollback of certain regulatory requirements. As we know, there's going to be a lot of executive orders. There have been a lot of executive orders issued saying that, this particular entity or group is going to be shut down, or there's going to be less funding put into the federal government for things such as EPA budgets. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change the regulatory requirements. So maybe there'll be a situation where there's less federal enforcement. Certainly the state agencies are unaffected. And to be honest with you, most states are delegated that type of authority. So you don't often have EPA oversight of projects. Is typically happening at a state level. So even if you have rollbacks at EPA at a federal level, the state agencies are still going to be delegated authority. There's going to manage these projects, these permits, and do the enforcement. So nothing really changes as far as the day-to-day operations of what to expect on that. As we shift their enforcement responsibilities from federal to state, that's certainly something that's been happening for decades now. So I wouldn't anticipate there'd be a lot of change in there, because the states still have a mandate to be able to uphold what they're delegated to take on. So even if there are weakened provisions under things such as regulatory statutes or funding mechanisms, I think at the end of the day, it's important to keep in mind that those federal frameworks, those regulatory requirements, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the states are mandated to follow through on those, and they're going to have the resources to be able to continue to do what they do, which is help out industry, help out clients to obtain those permits, get those permits issued, and make sure that they're staying on top of their obligations. So other things to consider as far as flexible planning is goes, so talk about adapting technologies or looking at ways and processes to improve your operations with these regulatory shifts. And we'll talk a little bit about tools that are out there. There's a lot of software platforms, but at the end of the day, it comes down to just having understanding, awareness of what those obligations are, and having a way to document those so the project team can be aware of what those requirements are. So communications, it's important that everyone understands what their obligations are, that they're proactive and transparent as far as what these efforts may be, whether it's the status of a permit application, the status of a review that's happening by a regulatory agency. We live in a very dynamic time, and that not only just the regulatory side, but there's certainly been a lot of situations where individuals are deciding to retire early, move off to a different industry, change careers. And so that institutional knowledge is really, really critical. And so we want to make sure that project documentation of those environmental requirements aspects, where things are at, are clearly documented so everyone can be able to find out where they're at in the process. So if someone suddenly decides to leave and there's not enough transition to be able to convey that, you can go into a project file and find all that information and know what's out there. And it's important also in that aspect of just, again, reviewing and knowing what those regulatory constraints are, or also beneficial situations. So it's not always a sense that a regulatory statute or requirement is going to be a constraint. It could be a benefit in certain circumstances where, if you're looking at site selection, this may be a more favorable situation for development because of the way those regulations are set up. So again, another thing as far as dynamic schedule is, some recommendations. Again, I don't think this is anything that's necessarily earth-shattering, but more of a reminder. It's important to make sure that you understand what startup date means for a particular project. So as you know, most environmental deliverables are hinged upon a startup date. So getting back to air permit, startup often can trip up certain companies, certain operations, certain businesses, because in their mind, startup means you're turning on the equipment. But in some cases, startup could be commencing of actual soil disturbance activities. So even under the context of the environmental requirement, regulation, or permit, it's always important that everyone on the project understand what those terms mean. So startup can mean different things, as I alluded to, whether or not you're putting natural gas into a particular device and starting to combust that natural gas, or you're turning the shovel and starting to dig, could trigger requirements as far as the time frame is concerned. So understanding those environmental obligations, again, the submittal dates. So one thing that's often overlooked as far as project planning is flexible planning is when those need to go in. Is it 180 days? Is it 360 days? Is it 90 days in advance of startup? So all that type of pre-planning really makes a big difference to be able to avoid potential missed opportunities, to be able to stay ahead of schedule. And that's where this dynamic schedule comes in. You try to build in these buffers of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. So if there is project slippage or even advance, that you have the ability to be able to accommodate those changes regarding the process of the operation, so that you're not at a pitch point where all of a sudden there's a delay and your obligation to have a permit is now 30 days out instead of 90 days out. So all those things really just need to be mindful of, and it allows you to have that dynamic schedule once you understand what those obligations are under each of those environmental aspects or permits that are issued. So project goals, obviously, it's about understanding. Everyone has an understanding of what those goals are for the project. And those goals obviously is, complete the project on time, on budget, and on quality. But beyond that, those micro goals of understanding, okay, we need to have this particular submittal into an agency on this date. We're going to target that 30 days in advance. So everyone has a clear understanding of what your goals are as far as achieving timelines, but also your goals to be able to get particular documentation in place, permits in place within that sequence of that life cycle. So that gets back to timelines and obligations, understanding clearly the entire project team of what those obligations are, so that there's no misconstruence of, oh, we don't need this permit for another year when you actually need it in 6 months. If there's that kind of really misunderstanding, it's going to lead to a lot of complications and problems later on. And also getting back to the idea of identifying those aspects and regulatory commitments early on, and have those as crystal clear as possible before proceeding down that pathway of project planning or implementation of a project. So how do you organize them priorities? What do you tackle first? So obviously there's going to be a lot of situations where requirements, obligations, permitting has to happen simultaneously. So it's not just a linear process where you can go in and say, Clean Air Act first, Clean Water Act second. No, there's going to be things that overlap and happen on top of each other. So that's about the understanding of when those due dates are, where do you need the resources, and to be able to make sure that those are managed properly, and how that's going to be completed in context of the construction timeline, to make sure that the resources and everything's in place before a project gets moving along. So, the last thing you want is a separate project schedule unrelated to environmental requirements, where construction is taking place at a different pace and a different timeline and doesn't coincide or align with those environmental requirements. That'll be a disaster. So everything needs to be unified and put together to understand what those obligations are. So how do you outsource, or what do you complete internally? That's always a question to answer and ask early on, and understanding what the resources are available for your team, for your client's team, and what they need to outsource. Doesn't mean everything needs to be outsourced. Sometimes it does make sense. Sometimes they can take on projects and task themselves and keep those internal to their company and to their operation to be able to manage those. It just comes down to understanding what resources are available and what resources are best used from third parties to be able to manage that. But that's part of the pre-planning aspect of understanding these environmental obligations. Once you know what those obligations are, then you can plan out what those timelines look like, how do you achieve those goals, and how do you line up the resources to be able to manage those and keep them on track. So what are the resources that are available? There's a variety of different things out there that can be used as far as tools, federal databases, state databases, third-party consulting support. At the end of the day, there's not one answer for that question. It's about just doing that diligence and looking to use all those resources to the best ability possible to understand what needs to happen, and where that information resides. So, obviously not everyone can do everything themselves, and that's why you hire third-party consultants to be able to help manage those tasks, manage those obligations, manage those environmental aspects. And so you certainly rely on them to be able to keep up with those commitments. That's part of their commitment to you as a client, is that they're going to create those documents and get those plans and permits in place, and you don't have to necessarily worry about it. But you still want to be mindful and knowledgeable about what's going on with that process, to understand that, okay, if they're saying we need a Title V permit for our operations for air permitting, what's the basis of that, and understand why that's the case. Just don't ever put yourself in a situation where you're relying on a third party to make all these decisions and not have understanding of the basis of that. You really want to have clarity about where that information comes from, and that's where these resources such as state and federal resources come into play. One thing that's out there is there's a variety of tools out there under the guidance and rules. So guidance has become a big thing as of late for state and federal agencies. It's not necessarily a regulation, but EPA is doing that quite a bit right now, issuing guidance to say, here's our interpretation of this particular rule in a different light. So again, this is something that gets really detailed and in the weeds, and certainly hard for anyone to say, yeah, I'm going to keep up with every type of guidance that comes out from a federal agency. But just keep in mind that that's one way to get some interpretation, understanding of a particular area or topic. Quite often, environmental professionals such as myself will look at what that guidance is from federal EPA or from state agencies to help understand what needs to happen within a particular sector or area as far as compliance activities are concerned. So one great tool out there, and I use quite extensively just for the initial starting point, and it's not coverage of everything, but it's just called Environmental Compliance History Online, ECHO. Some of you are familiar with it, some of you aren't, but it's just basically, it's been a clearinghouse, a database of particular industries and companies to be able to find out what are their environmental obligations on a federal level that EPA is aware of, that they have to report and keep up with. Now, This is good in a certain sense, not necessarily for new businesses, but if you're looking to work with a third party, say if you want to use a vendor, for example, a waste handler, Echo would be a good tool for you to say, okay, if we have a company that says they're going to manage waste for my business, for my operation, for my client, I can go in and do a quick search of them on Echo and say, oh, they have obligations with RCRA, an air permit, a wastewater permit, and it also will tell you if there's been reported non-compliance or if there's significant non-complier. So it's a great tool for researching companies and businesses to find out what their footprint looks like. I tell a lot of manufacturing clients, if they've never done it before, and some have and some haven't, take a look at what your Echo profile for your operation, your entity, your business looks like, and see what's in there, because sometimes there could be information that's incorrect or dated, that's not current. So anyway, it's a great tool for a lot of reasons, but it helps you understand what's going on in a particular industry. And on that note, one thing that's great is if you're looking to find out about a particular sector or business, you can use this tool to say, what are the typical permits, what people are picking up within this particular category of business. So it gives you an understanding of what their environmental footprint may be within a certain area. And then that gives you a benchmark, if you know nothing else, of what has this other company that competes with ours, what have they obtained as far as permitting is concerned? And it may shed some light on some obligations that your business, your operation, your client may have. State databases and resources, a lot of different agencies out there that have a lot of information. I know a lot of times we talk about federal government, and federal government, as they're rolling back their resources, will have less information online. But states, certain states have a lot of good information, a lot of guidance, brochures, pamphlets, resources for small businesses, as tools for helping you pull together information. And I know this is probably something not any of you would have to do directly, but as you realize of working with others, that knowing that these resources are out there can really help provide great resources to be able to help your project move along, especially if there's situations there may not be known or unclear requirements. So looking through these state benefits, these state resources really makes a big difference on being able to understand what's out there and what can be available to move your project in a better way. So environmental compliance tools, we mentioned this as far as Gantt charts, project charts, and tracking those aspects, what those requirements are. Obviously, you can use things such as spreadsheets or databases and documented lists as a starting point. And if it's not a complex project, those are perfectly fine. But as you get into more complex projects, there's third-party software that can be used by companies, by entities to help manage those requirements. There's a lot of them out there. This is just an example of a few of the big ones that have been around for a long period of time. But at the end of the day, these are just tools to help a client and operations understand what their obligations are, manage those obligations, and be able to track them to make sure that nothing is being missed or overlooked. A lot of these are going to be framed around the operational state of a manufacturing industrial client. So they don't really have a lot of benefit on the early part, but I will say that the sooner an entity can understand what their aspects are, both on the construction phase and on the operational phase, and can have those documented in some form, it provides that clarity of understanding what those are, and it's something that can be shared with a multitude of individuals involved with the project, so that information doesn't get lost in the shuffle. So I mentioned project tools. Obviously they're one easy tool to use or easy to set up. They're not inexpensive. It doesn't take but time to be able to compile what those obligations are. And again, this is sort of a list here of things that happen in the active or operational phase. But at the same time, you can set up those obligations and aspects on the pre-planning construction phase as well. There is macro capabilities where you can do things such as interactive cells where there's some logic to them. Conditional formatting where you can have date trigger things that if there's a date obligation. So there are certain things you can do with an Excel spreadsheet or other similar tool that allow you to be able to manage your obligations and have that information readily available. The cons of a spreadsheet is it's just a static. So a list, a spreadsheet, it's often restricted on being able to provide notifications, communications, alerts. So when you talk about getting into more software systems, that help provide notifications of those obligations. These kind of tools are great for listing out what those requirements are, but being active, they're not great on. So that's the downside of them. They're easy to put together, but they're not going to automate. They're not going to be able to provide notifications. And that's where things such as, we lost the slide here. So I'll get back into it. It's really gets back into using those tools such as these software tools of third-party compliance software. Those provide a lot more resources, whether it may be on the construction phase or the operational phase, to be able to provide those notifications. So, okay, we want a 30-day reminder that this form is due, or we need to have a trigger date 180 days in advance that a permit application is due for the project. And so you want to be able to get that information communicated out to all the responsible persons, but also others, so that there is some oversight and things don't get overlooked or missed. So that kind of takes me through this presentation of different items, just to kind of bounce around regarding project planning, and some closing thoughts here. Just to be able to kind of wrap this up and summarize it, is you want to identify all those aspects that are applicable to your project at the beginning as much as possible, but also be prepared to add in additional aspects as you go through the evolution of a project, whether it's pre-planning, construction, or operational. New requirements, new obligations may come up with new environmental regulations. You may have some that diminish or drop off, not as likely as the newer ones coming in. But more importantly, as you're going through the project, there'll be discoveries of where something may have been missed. So we always need to have that dynamic ability of saying, let's review where we're at with our aspects, our obligations, and do that on a routine basis to see if there's anything new based on the information you have, the status of the project, that say, hey, by the way, we need to start looking into this other regulatory requirement, whether it be associated with storage tanks, whether it be recorded process potentially has air emissions that someone didn't account for. That's that dynamic nature of being able to keep that project aspect list clear and well defined. Allow time to pull together drafts and final deliverables. So whether talking about pre-planning and construction phase, there's often a lot more time that goes into pulling together the permit applications, the documentation, and more importantly, getting agency approval. I'll quickly put in here, more and more states are adopting these accelerated permit review process. Georgia, for example, did one a few years ago on the air permitting side. Many state agencies are looking at having this accelerated permit process. And the thought behind that was, okay, clients are coming to us, customers, regulated entities, and saying they need a permit within 60 days because there was a missed understanding of an obligation. So we're going to put in this accelerated permit review process. Well, in reality, what's happened is all these states have found out is that this pay to play situation where you pay a little bit more premium for them to accelerate your permit review, everybody's jumped onto that bandwagon, whether they need it or not. And so what's happened is many state agencies, for example, speaking of Georgia, have clearly said that they originally planned for having a handful of companies using this process. Now 90% of the permit applications go through this process. So no longer does your project actually differentiate it from anyone else. So when you're talking about pre-planning and that permit review process with an agency, it's important to understand what's their actual backlog look like, because they may have a commitment online that says our current permit review process is 3 months, 6 months, 1 month, whatever the case may be. But you always want to be able to have that conversation with the regulator and find out what your actual permit review process look like, either under an accelerated permit review or a normal process, and use that. Don't rely on just secondhand information or anything posted on our website. Find out what that actual review time period is, because it's actually probably going to be a little bit longer than you anticipate. And there are situations, again, quality information. If you submit information and it's missing certain key elements or incomplete, that creates delays in the review process. And unfortunately, with some agencies, especially more on local or state level, but more on the local level, is that if you have to go back and resubmit information, you sort of get reset in that review process. And next thing you know, you're not just, you could be another 60 days before they respond back to you just for that one simple omission. So quality information during that review period is important to make sure that it doesn't put any unnecessary delays in the process. Caution is becoming overly ambitious. So that meaning that, it's important to understand what your obligations are and do those obligations in a timely manner, but don't try to take on things too early in the process. What can happen is if you try to accelerate and say put together a permit application well in advance of when actual construction happens, there could be project implications. An example of that would be on the air permitting side. Many air permits, many agencies have provisions that say that if you're not going to start construction within a year, 2 years of a permit that was issued to allow for construction, that permit will self-terminate. You have to reapply for a new permit. So a year and a 2 year may sound, okay, that's a long period of time. The chances of that happening are very slim. And that's true. But I've seen time and time again with current funding constraints, where funding from different mechanisms, from grants, from federal grants, are and slowing down project implementation. And so you put a permit application into place thinking, okay, we're going to get to this and where construction will happen in a year and a half, and there's a delay, then you may have to resubmit that construction application for that permit again at a future point in time, if that makes sense. So it's just about understanding that you don't want to get too far advanced, too far ahead of actual operations and construction period to be able to make sure that the permitting it falls in line with what your requirements are. Making sure information and knowledge is well documented, easily accessible. You want to make sure that everyone on the project team understands where you're at on the play field. If you're in a certain part of the process, you have an application that's in, you want to make sure everyone understands the application went in, and rightfully so, when the expectation is of having a response back from the agency. And so that way it helps project teams not to get ahead of themselves, where they think, oh, the application went in, we can go ahead and get started. Well, that application only went in, that didn't give you approval to start the action. So it's about communicating and understanding what's allowed, what you can do during that cycle of obtaining those permits, whether it's for construction or for operation. So another thing is make sure you focus the additional efforts on those higher risk concerns. And so by that meaning that if there are going to be things that are going to be sensitive, whether it be for a particular group that has a keen interest in this business, this manufacturing client, because of news that went out, there's going to be sensitivity regarding their presence. You're going to expect there's going to be a lot of reviews under local code ordinance, or there might be reviews on the air permitting side. I have had a number of projects over the years where I've had a conversation with the state agency, and the state agency says, before I even approach them, say, oh, we've already heard about this client. There's already a buzz coming from the local community about it. And so, when you have those higher profile issues, for whatever reason, that information made it out about this client, this manufacturing presence, this business wanting to expand, startup operation, you want to make sure you have good resources to be able to build around that, to identify what those potential pitfalls are, clear out any obstacles that may come into play, and be able to address those sooner than later. And there are tools out there for helping do better reviews, things such as used under what we will call a process hazard analysis or OSHA requirements, but these pre-startup reviews, these management of change, these HAZOP reviews, these are kind of advanced tools that you use to help analyze the situation, understand risk and deficiencies in a project. Now, those are not necessarily applied for project planning, but they're examples more on an operational situation. But it gets back to the idea of just make sure you identify what those risks are and how you can identify those on the front end to minimize any impacts it would have to the project. And then again, establish a process and a project framework, but be prepared to change it, but not abandon it. So you want to be able to have something that you're really crystallize about what those obligations are, what your aspects are, what you need to commit to, and have the team and the framework to be able to support to make that happen. Whether you outsource that, use internal resources, both, however you want to do that, but a clear playing field, a clear understanding of who's on first, who's on second, and everybody works together, and then make sure that team communicates during the process and the project to make sure that nothing is being missed. And that doesn't mean you're looking over everyone's shoulder all the time. It's just having that open dialogue to say, oh, do you got this covered? Great, and avoid potential mishaps. So that takes me through to my particular presentation. Just, last comment here. In my opinion, regulatory uncertainty and no regulations work against development. I'm not a pro EPA, pro regulatory person, even though I came out at my career as a regulator. There's certainly a place for them, and there's certainly a time for them, and there's certainly a way to be able to set those up so they make sense, they're structured, they're clear, and they're easily followed and understood. But having no regulations, I think, creates chaos, and that makes it more difficult to actually be able to have people understand what do I need to do. It's great to say, well, we have no regulations, but what happens in voids in a vacuum, if there's nothing there, things fill in. And sometimes what fills into that void or vacuum is more onerous or more burdensome than what was already there. So, you don't want to be in a situation where you don't know, because that creates potential for chaos. So, that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to entertain any questions you may have on regulatory frameworks, regulatory changes, and aspects as it relate to, any type of growth and development project you may have. And I see that Jacob shared a thought on the chat, so you're welcome to post stuff on chat as well. Well, one other thing to share is that, a lot of times people see regulators and regulators or regulatory agencies as being a potential hindrance or a bad thing. Just keep in mind, quite a few of them are with a white hat mentality. Certainly in southern states, they tend to be a little bit more of a mindset of wanting to help out and make sure that your operation and entity and project stays on track. No one really wants to see a situation where there's just chaos. So don't be afraid to reach out to them in certain circumstances. They're a resource. There's a lot of other resources out there, small business associations, different trade groups out there that can provide guidance and insight. Peers, there's a lot of resources beyond the regulators that you can refer to for help and support. And obviously third parties such as Terracon or other companies that are out there as well to provide guidance and clarity. So there's something posted. When local EDOs are meeting with prospects for site visits, are 1 to 2 critical permitting components you recommend consistently addressing with their presentation or at the site? Usually the two things that I've seen most of as far as permitting aspects for me personally is the air permitting and the wastewater permitting. I've had a few examples here in the last year or so where a new manufacturing presence was being established in a rural area that, for example, on the wastewater side, found the perfect site, except it did not have any wastewater services. It had no PLTW infrastructure. And unfortunately, the nearest receiving body was a very small water body that already had an impairment for certain pollutants. So it was problematic to try to go there. So been quite a bit of effort to find a method to be able to manage their wastewater in a cost-effective approach. And so that gets back to some due diligence and pre-planning. It's one thing to understand, okay, we know we're going to have wastewater, industrial wastewater from our operation. We know that we can't just, necessarily just haul it off site because of the cost. So what do we do with that? So that's something that happens really on the pre-planning side, is understanding what you have in the way of local PLTW sewer service or water bodies, and understand what those water bodies may be able to accommodate. That's an important screening tool. On the air side, typically what happens is, with air permitting, if it's a complex permit, a large site, a large entity, it's going to be a major source. And if it's something that the public is, for whatever reason, found out about and concerned about, the regulators are going to potentially give a lot more scrutiny to it, and it's going to take time to get through that permitting application process. So I would certainly say on both those things, the Clean Water Act, as far as wastewater and air permitting, air emissions regarding potential source, look at those as much as we can in advance and start that planning process. Obviously, you may not have all the details of understanding what that construction, what that project looks like as far as all the sources, but you certainly would have enough information to be able to say, okay, what are our pathways to be able to get successful process or permit to allow us to be able to manage those aspects. Business retention expansion programs for the local EDOs. Are there a couple questions to ask when visiting existing industry that would be helpful to make sure they have sufficient reg com programs avoiding penalties? Well, I think the most important thing is, it's always a bit sensitive when you're going into an existing business and say, are you out of compliance or are you in compliance? Certain businesses will not take that in the right way. So it's really kind of just asking the question of what are your resources when it comes to, your environmental commitments? How many people do you have involved helping out with those projects? Do you have a team of individuals that are involved with this effort, or is it just one person that has 10 assets or 10 operations they're trying to keep up with? And once you have a feel of what the resources are, then you can ask the question of, okay, well, how do you respond and avoid, potential missed opportunities? What tools do you have? And ask what resources they use as far as how do you track your obligations? Do you use a spreadsheet? Because there's a lot of tools out there. Now, I will say, there's a lot of software systems out there and they're great. And I know that I tried to sell my business owners at one point when I had the 3 manufacturing plants, I'm purchasing those, but they did not want to invest the money into it. So even though there's resources out there, there is a cost consideration for that. So sometimes businesses are reluctant to say, I can't justify spending $80,000 to buy into a third-party environmental management software, but that's where those other tools come into place. So I think it's about just working with them to understand what they have in the way of knowledge and resources, and make sure they have awareness of what their obligations are. And you can also take a look at their ECHO report as well, that environmental compliance history. Before you even go meet with a company, you can bring them up and say, okay, here's the permits the EPA is aware of or regulatory requirements. And you can see if there's been potential what they call significant noncompliance or high priority violators for some reason. That'd be a good indication of where they've had some potential issues in the past and where they're struggling with commitments. Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour here at 1:56 for my time. Certainly, if you have questions, if you have anything that you want to bounce off to me, please reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to have a conversation and kind of share insights or thoughts or provide guidance. I'm really more than willing to just want to be able to help out any individual avoid noncompliance and pitfalls within their project. And certainly the whole Terracon team has that mindset. So we have a lot of resources available to help out if there's any questions that come up from any environmental aspect. And there's other resources we will direct you to. If we're not the right people, we're going to tell you we're not the right people. We'll find you the help that you need for your project.
Well, Chris, thank you so much, and to the team at being involved in good questions. And I hope that our members got to connect with Team Terracon at our site selection summit, because you all were rolling deep for sure, and we're so appreciative of that and look forward to all the future opportunities. So thank you to Terracon, to the members involved here, and for we hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing some of you at Select USA and everyone else at our annual conference soon. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.